Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today I want to talk about the best books I read in 2020.
Whoa, oh, oh. Da, 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 oh, oh, oh. Da, 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 oh, oh, oh. Da, 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 da. Making our Christmas memories.
Now looking back at the books I gave 5 stars to on Goodreads, there's actually not that many and I'm surprised by how few there are. I only gave 5 books 5 stars. And the first two I want to talk about are non-fictions and their memoirs. And I don't really want to say a lot about this. I have a whole video about memoirs where they're included. I'm going to link that for you if you want to check them out. I really love memoirs. I think they're a great way of showcasing a person and their experiences. And of course, I know that they're one-sided, but I think there's something about telling your story through your own eyes, and it makes you really connect to that person. And especially in audio format, when it's narrated by the author, I think they give a little bit extra to the book and to the experience of listening to that. And these two memoirs are Roxane Gay's Hunger and Heavy by Kiese Laymon. They're both kind of like deal with the topic of being overweight. In Roxane Gay's case, she had this awful trauma in her childhood, which makes her kind of hide behind her body. And this is a book about that, about how her world has changed because of what happened to her when she was a young girl, and how her life changed because of that, and how her body became such a big part of who she is, but also such a great part of how people view her. And in this book, she talks about how she grew up with that body, what that body means to her, and also about really practical things and obstacles she has to face when she's living in a large body. And here I remember this particular section of the book when she goes to restaurants, for example. She has to maybe call in advance and ask them what kind of chairs they have, because maybe she won't fit in all types of chairs. And this is something you really not think about until you are faced with the reality of sitting in a chair so uncomfortably that you're almost sitting at the very edge of it. So you use a lot of your muscles in your legs to keep yourself, and then to keep smiling and behaving like nothing's wrong, when all along you're kind of screaming in the inside because you can't really sit properly in this chair, but you're also can't really tell anyone how uncomfortable you are. It was quite a vivid scene, and it really kind of stuck with me. This is a really beautiful, heartbreaking memoir. In Heavy by Kiese Laymon, we learn about his life and his childhood growing up in a black male body. And we learn about his relationship with his mother and how dysfunctional that was. His mother was a really educated, highly intelligent woman who did everything in her power in her own way to prepare Kiese to live in a black body, in a black male body in the US, because she knew how hard it is to live in such a body because of racism and so on and so forth. But the way she did this was so unusual, because even though she had high expectations of him in respect to his studies, she was kind of lacking in many other ways, because sometimes there wasn't enough food in the house. And we learn about his experiences as growing up as a child, and how those experiences kind of marked him again in some ways. And he talks about how the Black community somehow fails to protect their children, both male and female, and how those experiences you have in the child as a child kind of mark you. I don't want to go into details here, but there are some really difficult topics here. So overall, we follow Kiese throughout his life, how he becomes a professor, and also the difficulties he faces as a professor and as a student before that at the university, in a university environment, also because of racism. He has a lot of difficult relationship with his family, especially with his mother, as already mentioned. And some of these difficulties and some of these issues he faces kind of manifest itself in his body, because he's overweight at some times but bulimic in other times. So it's really a hard-hitting book. I'm not the perfect one to talk about this. This is not written for me. It is clearly stated in this book that this book is for a Black audience. But I think it is a great one to pick up if you're interested in these topics. Both with Roxane Gay and this one, I think they're great ones to read. And even though I think most people have heard about Roxane Gay and have read her books and her memoir, not so many people have heard maybe of Heavy. So if you haven't and you liked Roxane Gay's memoir, then I think this one would also be a great one for you. Next on my list is one I have read at the beginning of the year, but this has really, really stayed with me for until today. I remember that reading experience. I think it is one that maybe I would like to reread at some point, and that's not something I say often of a book. It is The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow, and this is Pride and Prejudice retelling. In this one, we follow Mary, who is kind of like, I call her the forgotten sister, because she's always in the background and she's always frowned upon because of her very strict views and her really speaking out of turn, or speaking when you're not supposed to speak, or really having opinions maybe people expect you to keep to yourself. There are kind of two parts in this book. The first part, where we follow Mary with the Bennet family, and this is kind of in like the Pride and Prejudice kind of like a setting. And in the second book is where Mary is out of that environment and where she comes into her own, and that part really focuses on her love story. I think I really prefer the first part because of the connection to Pride and Prejudice, but it was also very, very emotional. We kind of learn who Mary is, why she is the way she is, all the way from childhood until the events in Pride and Prejudice. And that part was so emotional. I really felt for her and I really came to understand her better. The second part is where the romance is and where she gets her happy ending. So I don't want to say a lot about that. But I think if you really love Jane Austen's books, or if you really want a great romance, I don't necessarily feel that you would need to read Pride and Prejudice for this. I think maybe you would get more out of it. Definitely you should, maybe you already watched the movie adaptation and then you're fine. But if you love Jane Austen and if you love a great romance, I would highly, highly recommend The Other Bennet Sister. Okay, now we're down to the last two, and the one I want to talk about first is Normal People by Sally Rooney. Now, I'm one of those who really liked this book, but I also understand those who really didn't like this book. I think this is, people kind of tend to be in one or the other end of the spectrum here. Maybe there's no much middle ground when it comes to these people. I have both read the book and seen the miniseries, and I actually really liked both. What I think is great about this, and I don't want to talk a lot about it because I think most people know what this book is about, but why I think is so great is because it is about that relationship and how relationships are not so simple, and how relationships, maybe it's not just about the two people involved in the relationship. It is also about society and how unwillingly we are slaves to society's expectations. Many times I wanted to shake these two people up and just tell them to pull themselves together, but that's just not how life works. And yes, many people would say that this is kind of unrealistic and over the top, and that these people are kind of silly in a way. And yes, they are, but these people are also young. And I think in some way they reflect their generation, especially at the beginning with when they were in high school. I felt that was quite out there in some ways. But also we have to remember that both of these protagonists come from very different environments, and you have to remember how the family environment impacts us in more ways than we can even imagine. And I think here it's a clear example of how Connell, all he has is his mother, but they have such a beautiful relationship, and that kind of makes him a more stable, balanced person who can make the right decisions. But on the other hand, we have Marianne, who from the outsider perspective has everything, but because of her family life is the way it is, she makes the really, really bad decisions over and over again. And this kind of impact this relationship. So yeah, let me know in which category you fall, if you read Normal People, love it or hate it. And if you hate it, why? If you love it, why? Anyway, I think no matter where you are, this book had an impact on people. And yeah, I can only recommend it from my perspective, and I will definitely check out Sally Rooney's books in the future. And the very, very last one I have is The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. Now, I've said this many times this year, but Kazuo Ishiguro has become one of my favorite authors of all time. Remains of the Day, I think, so far, I'm pretty sure it will be my favorite. There's just something about the emotions and that main character and the way it transports us to that time and that setting. It has that Downton Abbey-esque element to it as well. But I think it's mainly the main character we fall in love with. And there's no wonder that this book is on so many people's favorite books of all times lists. So in Remains of the Day, if you don't know, we follow Stevens. He's an aging butler. He works in this great mansion who has now a new owner from the US. And all the family who owned this house is no more, or they just sold the house. I'm not exactly sure anymore. But we follow this butler who has lived in that great house for most of his life as a butler, and who really devoted himself to his position and his image as a butler. We go back in time because Stevens goes on this road trip to meet an old friend who used to work with him at this house. And on this road trip, we kind of go back and forth in time, and we follow his life in this mansion and how this is kind of also where the political decisions are kind of taken for the whole country in this house, and how he felt like he was kind of at the center of all this. I think we see Stevens for who he is, and it's just so heartbreaking to see his decisions and then to realize the impact those decisions had on the rest of his life. This really made me cry. And I think Stevens, everyone who read this novel has Stevens in a little corner of their heart. Kazuo Ishiguro is truly a master of writing and of character development in this book. I haven't seen the TV adaptation with Anthony Hopkins yet. I'm not sure I'm ready if it's as good as the book, but I will definitely watch that at some point. Let me know if you did and what you thought about it. But yeah, I think The Remains of the Day is a masterpiece, and Kazuo Ishiguro is just one of the best writers ever, I believe. So yeah, these are all the books I have here. Let me know, what is your best book of 2020? I would be interested to know. Thank you very much for watching and sticking with me to the end if you did. And I'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Making our Christmas memories.